Something lurks in the darkness beyond your screen. It feeds on hesitation. On the Void of Fears channel, we don't just tell scary stories. We reveal what truly watches you when you think you're alone. Join our 8K subscribers as we race to 10K by year's end. Like, comment, subscribe before it notices you've seen this video. It's already too late to look away. Now let's dive into today's story. The rain pattered against the windows of the Johnson Space Center, casting long, gloomy shadows through Dr. Diane Patel's office. April in Houston often brought these sudden downpours, transforming the normally bustling NASA headquarters into a contemplative sanctuary of soft rainfall and subdued conversations. Diane shook the water from her umbrella before stepping inside, the familiar scent of coffee and recycled air greeting her. As Assistant Director of Communications, her mornings typically began with review meetings and press briefings, but today something different awaited her. An unmarked, cream-coloured envelope sat dead centre on her otherwise immaculate desk. "Morning, Dr. Patel," called her assistant from the doorway. "That came through internal mail, no sender information." Diane picked up the envelope, noting its unusual weight and texture. "Thanks, Kevin. Any idea who dropped it off?" "None. It was in the morning delivery batch. Want me to look into it?" She shook her head, curiosity already piqued. "I'll handle it. Can you push my 9 a.m. back 30 minutes? Alone in her office, Diane carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter handwritten in deep blue ink on what appeared to be high-quality stationery, slightly yellowed at the edges as if aged. The handwriting was precise, almost architectural in its precision. Her eyes went immediately to the date at the top, January 17th, 2048. "What the hell?" she murmured, continuing to read. "To the current leadership at NASA, my name is Dr. Elliot Grayson, Head of Quantum Communications Division. I'm writing from what is your future regarding matters of urgent importance. Yesterday we celebrated the successful completion of the Artemis 7 mission, which established our permanent research facility on the far side of the moon. Astronauts Commander Lena Wilson, pilot Jason Kendrick, and specialists Rohan Mehta and Olivia Taylor are returning safely to Earth after a groundbreaking 6-month deployment. The technology that allows me to communicate with your time is unstable, so I must be direct. You have to stop Project Horizon. If you don't, we all die. I will send more details in subsequent communications. For now, this message serves as verification of my authenticity. When NASA announces Artemis 7 next week, compare the crew manifest to this letter. Time is already running out. Dr. Elliot Grayson, Quantum Communications Division, NASA 2048. Diane read the letter 3 times, her initial amusement fading with each pass. NASA was indeed finalizing plans for the next phase of Artemis missions, but those details were classified. Only a handful of people knew the proposed crew assignments that were going to be announced next week. She reached for her phone, then hesitated. Reporting this apparent security breach would trigger an investigation, possibly delaying the Artemis announcement. And what if it was just a prank from someone within the agency? That had to be it, some engineer with inside information having a laugh. Still, the letter felt off, not just its contents, but its very existence. The paper felt wrong somehow, too smooth yet fibrous, and the ink had a strange iridescence when it caught the light. Diane slipped the letter into her desk drawer and locked it, deciding to wait for the Artemis announcement before raising any alarms. This Project Horizon, mentioned in the letter, wasn't anything she'd heard of in her 15 years at NASA. Just a prank, she told herself. A detailed, disturbing prank. She couldn't have known that this was merely the first whisper from a future desperately trying to communicate with the past. The Johnson Space Center's press room buzzed with excitement as Director Phillips stepped up to the podium, camera flashes illuminating his confident smile. Diane stood at the back of the room, the mysterious letter burning a hole in her thoughts. "Today marks another bold step in humanity's return to the moon," Phillips announced. "I'm pleased to introduce the crew of Artemis 7, which will establish our first permanent research facility on the lunar far side." Diane held her breath as he began to announce the names. Mission Commander Lena Wilson. A tall woman with cropped silver hair stepped forward, waving to the crowd. Pilot Jason Kendrick. A younger man with a serious expression nodded at the cameras. Mission Specialists Dr. Rohan Mehta and Dr. Olivia Taylor. 2 more astronauts joined the lineup, completing the crew of 4. Exactly as the letter had predicted. The press conference continued, but Diane heard nothing else. Blood rushed in her ears as she slipped out of the room and hurried back to her office. She retrieved the letter, reading it again with trembling hands. The crew manifest matched perfectly, names that had been finalized only 2 days ago in a closed-door meeting. This wasn't a prank. It couldn't be. A desk phone rang, startling her. "Dr. Patel, Director Phillips would like to see you immediately," her assistant said, his voice uncharacteristically tense. 10 minutes later, she sat in the director's office across from Phillips and a man she recognized as Lucas Merritt, one of NASA's most brilliant aerospace engineers. "You received one too?" Phillips asked without preamble, sliding a letter identical to hers across the desk. Diane nodded, producing her own letter. "Mine came 3 days ago," Phillips continued. "I thought it was a hoax until today, when we received this." He handed her another envelope. The new letter was on the same unusual paper, in the same handwriting, but dated January 24th, 2048. "The oxygen recycling system on the ISS will fail at approximately 3:14 p.m. this Friday. The primary catalyst chamber will develop microfractures due to manufacturing defects in the replacement parts installed last month. No one will be injured, but without immediate intervention, the situation could become critical. When this occurs, it should remove any doubt about my identity and the gravity of my warnings. Project Horizon must be stopped. The technology you're developing, or will develop, creates an irreparable tear in space-time. More details to follow. Dr. Elliot Grayson. Manufacturing defects in replacement parts." Lucas spoke for the first time, his voice a blend of skepticism and concern. "We just installed new oxygen recycling components on the ISS 3 weeks ago." Phillips leaned forward. "I've ordered a complete analysis of those components, but there's no way to physically inspect them without sending a crew up." "And you think these letters are legitimate?" Diane asked, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice despite what she'd witnessed at the press conference. "I don't know what to think," Phillips admitted, "but I need you two to find out who's sending them. If there's a security breach, I want it plugged. If it's something else..." He trailed off, leaving the impossible alternative unspoken. "Start with this Elliot Grayson. Check every database, every employee record going back 50 years. And keep this between us for now." 3 days later, Lucas burst into Diane's office without knocking. His face was ashen, his usually meticulous appearance disheveled. "The ISS oxygen system failed 30 minutes ago," he said hoarsely, "exactly as predicted, down to the minute." May brought unseasonable heat to Houston, and 5 more letters to NASA headquarters. Each arrived in the same unmarked envelope, each predicted events with unnerving accuracy. A fuel line anomaly during a test fire, a power fluctuation in the deep space network, the unexpected discovery of subsurface ice deposits by a Mars rover, and the sudden withdrawal of a key private contractor from the Artemis program. Diane and Lucas converted a forgotten conference room into their investigation headquarters, walls covered with the letters and connected events, looking for patterns, explanations, anything to make sense of what was happening. "The paper is unlike anything I've ever seen," Lucas said, examining a sample under a portable microscope. "The cellulose structure is artificially engineered at the molecular level. We don't have the technology to create this." Diane paced the room, staring at the timeline they'd constructed. And the ink contains trace elements of an isotope our lab can't even identify. So, either we're dealing with an incredibly sophisticated hoax using technology that doesn't exist, or these really are messages from the future, Diane finished. They'd searched every database for Elliot Grayson, employee records, birth records, academic journals, social media, nothing. It was as if the person writing to them didn't exist. The letters keep mentioning Project Horizon, but there's no record of it anywhere in NASA's files, Lucas said, rummaging through yet another stack of classified project summaries. The latest letter lay open between them, its final paragraph reading, "Time is growing short in both our realities. The quantum link weakens with each transmission. You need to understand what Project Horizon becomes before it's too late. The answers are in storage facility 37B, archive room 12. Look for the theoretical applications that were deemed too dangerous to pursue. What you considered impossible in your time becomes devastating in mine." Dr. Elliot Grayson, storage facility 37B, Diane repeated, turning to her computer. "Let's see what that is." After an hour of searching through NASA's labyrinthine archival records, they found it. A decommissioned records building on the far edge of the Johnson Space Center campus, used primarily during the 1970s and 80s to store physical copies of research proposals and rejected project applications. It says here it was scheduled for demolition in 2011, but the funding was redirected, Lucas noted, reading from the facility database. "So it might still be standing," Diane said, already reaching for her jacket. "Let's find out." The sun was beginning to set as they drove to the far perimeter of the NASA complex, following outdated maps to a neglected corner where old buildings sat in various states of disrepair, forgotten relics of space program history. Facility 37B was a low, bunker-like structure with faded lettering and dust-covered windows. The door's electronic lock had long since failed, but Diane's master keycard still triggered the backup mechanical system with a reluctant click. Inside, darkness greeted them, disturbed only by the beams of their flashlights sweeping across shelves of boxes and filing cabinets, stretching into the shadows. "Archive room 12, Lucas mumbled, shining his light on tarnished door plates as they moved deeper into the facility. "Here, this is it." The room was smaller than the others, containing perhaps 24 filing cabinets and several metal shelving units lined with dusty boxes. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, which Lucas managed to activate after some fumbling. "Looks like these are organized by project category and year," Diane observed, examining the cabinet labels. "Here, theoretical applications, 1985 to 1990. They worked methodically through the drawers until Lucas suddenly went still, a thin manila folder in his hands. "Diane," he said quietly, "look at this." The tab on the folder read Theoretical Application Project Horizon 1987. Diane felt a chill run through her as Lucas opened the folder on a nearby desk. Inside were perhaps 20 pages of technical documents, diagrams, and handwritten notes, yellowed with age and marked with multiple rejected stamps. The project summary on the first page made her breath catch. Project Horizon proposes the development of a deep space probe equipped with an experimental, quantum-based artificial intelligence system designed to observe and analyze space-time distortions in the vicinity of black holes. The proposed technology would utilize a novel approach to quantum entanglement that theoretically allows for temporal observation capabilities. Recommendation: rejection. The proposed methodologies involve technology far beyond our current capabilities and present too many unknown variables. The committee expresses particular concern regarding Section 7.3, wherein the proposal suggests the possibility of two-way temporal information transfer. This concept is deemed physically impossible and potentially dangerous to pursue. "Temporal information transfer," Lucas whispered. they were proposing time communication in 1987. But it was rejected, Diane pointed out, and according to these notes, the theoretical framework was deemed fundamentally flawed. Lucas flipped through more pages, stopping at a handwritten note in the margins of a dense technical document. Revisit core concept with quantum tech, estimate 2035. Someone thought this might be possible around 2035, he said, and now we're getting letters from 2048. But what does this have to do with us now? Diane asked. These letters make it sound like Project Horizon is something happening soon, not some rejected concept from the 80s. Lucas didn't answer immediately, still examining the documents with growing concern. The thing about rejected projects is that sometimes their core ideas get broken up and incorporated into other initiatives, he finally said, especially when the only objection is that the technology doesn't exist yet. You think components of Project Horizon might be in development now, just under different names? I think we need to look at every cutting-edge project currently in development and see if anything aligns with these concepts. They gathered the documents and locked up the facility, the weight of their discovery settling between them like an invisible presence. Whatever Project Horizon was, or would become, it had frightened someone in the future badly enough to attempt the impossible, reaching back through time to stop it. Back in their makeshift investigation room, Diane and Lucas spread out the Project Horizon documents alongside the mysterious letters. Morning light streamed through the blinds, casting striped shadows across their discovery. The original proposal was submitted by Dr. Thomas Wayland, Lucas noted, pointing to the signature. Never heard of him. Me neither, Diane said, already typing the name into her tablet. Here we go, Dr. Thomas Wayland, theoretical physicist, worked for NASA from 1975 to 1993. Died in 2007. Any next of kin? Anyone who might have continued his work? One daughter, Amanda Wayland, biology professor at Stanford. No indication she followed in her father's footsteps. Lucas sighed, leaning back in his chair. So we have a rejected project from 38 years ago that somehow becomes catastrophic in the future. The timing doesn't make sense, Diane mused, rereading one of the letters. Elliot Grayson writes as if Project Horizon is imminent in our timeline, not something decades away. Lucas picked up the folder again, flipping to a section labelled Technical Requirements. His eyes widened as he read. Diane, look at this equipment list. Some of this technology didn't exist in 1987, but... He grabbed his tablet and pulled up current NASA projects. The Quantum Entanglement Communication System being developed for deep space missions. The Autonomous Decision-Making Protocols for the new generation of interplanetary probes. The Experimental Gravity Wave Detector Array. He lined up the documents side by side. These modern projects contain elements that, if combined, would create something very close to what Wayland was proposing for Project Horizon. Diane leaned forward, her heart racing. Are you saying we're inadvertently building components of Project Horizon right now, without realizing it? I'm saying it's possible. These separate projects were never meant to be integrated, but if someone were to see the connections between them... The sound of the door opening interrupted them. Director Phillips stood in the doorway, his expression grave. Another letter arrived, he said, holding up a familiar envelope, and we have a problem. The latest letter contained something new, a birth record search. It read, You won't find me in your records because I haven't been born yet. My mother is Dr. Rebecca Grayson, currently working in your quantum physics division. I will be born next month. This information should help verify my identity and the urgency of my message. Project Horizon must be stopped. The separate components are already being developed. When they are combined in 2027, they create what you'll call a quantum anchor, a fixed point in space-time that eventually destabilizes Earth's gravitational field. By my time, the effect has become irreversible. billions are dead, Dr. Elliot Grayson. Phillips's voice was strained when he spoke again. I had security check this. There is indeed a Dr. Rebecca Grayson in our quantum physics division. She's 8 months pregnant. Silence fell over the room as the implications sank in. I want you to talk to her, Phillips continued. Carefully. Find out if she knows anything about these projects or her future son. And if she does, Diane asked quietly, then we have a much bigger situation than a security breach. The Quantum Physics Division occupied a separate building on the Johnson Space Center campus, its interior a maze of laboratories and research spaces. Dr. Rebecca Grayson's office was at the end of a long corridor, the door marked with her name and title, Quantum Communications Research Lead. Diane knocked, exchanging a nervous glance with Lucas. "Come in," called a voice from inside. Dr. Rebecca Grayson was not what they expected. Despite being 8 months pregnant, she moved, with graceful efficiency, around her cluttered office. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her intelligent eyes assessed them quickly as they introduced themselves. "Communications and engineering," she said, raising an eyebrow. "This is an unusual visit. What can I help you with?" Diane had prepared a cover story about cross-departmental research integration, but standing before this woman, the mother of their mysterious correspondent, the lies felt hollow. "Dr. Grayson, this might sound strange, but we're conducting a security review of all ongoing quantum research projects," she began carefully. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly. "I have top-level clearance and my current projects are classified. You would need specific authorization to discuss them." Lucas stepped forward. "We're not here about your official projects exactly. We're interested in any theoretical work you might be doing outside your assigned research." The pregnant physicist went very still. "Who sent you?" "Director Phillips," Diane answered truthfully. Rebecca moved to her desk and sat down, one hand resting protectively on her swollen belly. After a moment of consideration, she opened a drawer and removed a leather-bound journal. "I've been having dreams," she said quietly. "Vivid, recurring dreams about my son as an adult, working here at NASA, telling me things I don't understand." She pushed the journal across the desk. "I've been documenting them. At first, I thought it was just pregnancy hormones, but..." She trailed off, watching as Diane opened the journal. Inside were meticulous notes, dated entries, and sketches. Diane felt a chill as she recognized phrases that matched the mysterious letters exactly. One page contained a drawing of a device labeled Horizon Anchor, its components detailed with scientific precision. "Have you told anyone else about these dreams?" Lucas asked gently. Rebecca shook her head. "Who would I tell? That I'm having psychic visions? Of my unborn son warning me about some future catastrophe?" She laughed humorlessly. "I'd be removed from my projects immediately." "What do you think these dreams mean?" Diane asked, turning to a page where Rebecca had written, in shaky handwriting, "You have to stop Project Horizon. If you don't, we all die." "I think..." Rebecca hesitated, absently stroking her belly. "I think somehow my son is trying to communicate with me across time. I know how that sounds, but I also know that quantum entanglement doesn't play by classical rules of causality." "Your current research," Lucas prompted. "What exactly are you working on?" Rebecca studied them both for a long moment before answering. "Quantum communication systems that could theoretically transmit information instantly across vast distances, regardless of relativistic limitations." "And could such a system transmit information through time?" Diane asked, holding her breath. "Theoretically," Rebecca's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "Under very specific conditions, involving massive gravitational distortions and precisely calibrated quantum states. Yes, information could move backward through time, but the energy requirements would be astronomical and the targeting mechanism would need to connect to something in the past. an anchor point. Lucas and Diane exchanged looks. An anchor point, like the quantum anchor mentioned in the latest letter. Dr. Grayson, Diane said carefully, what if we told you we've been receiving messages that appear to be from your unborn son in the future? Rebecca's eyes widened, her hand tightening on her belly. I'd say that explains a lot, and that we're in more trouble than any of us realize. Dr. Rebecca Grayson's apartment was meticulously organized, with bookshelves filled with physics texts and framed diplomas on the walls. She led Diane and Lucas to a small home office where a corkboard dominated one wall, covered with notes, diagrams, and printed articles. After the dreams became consistent, I started researching, she explained, gesturing to the board, looking for connections between my work and these visions. Lucas stepped closer to examine the board. These are component designs for separate NASA projects. How did you get access to all of these? Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. I have colleagues in different divisions. We discussed theoretical applications over lunch. Nothing classified, just concepts. She pointed to several designs pinned together. But when I laid them out like this, I started seeing how they could integrate. Into what? Diane asked, though she already suspected the answer. A communication system unlike anything we've built before, Rebecca said softly. Something that could potentially establish a fixed quantum connection point, what my dreams called a horizon anchor. She moved to her computer and pulled up a simulation. This is what happens if you create a fixed point in space-time that doesn't move with the natural expansion of the universe. The simulation showed a point of light with waves radiating outward, growing more intense with time. Eventually, the waves began distorting everything around them, creating a ripple effect that expanded exponentially. The anchor point creates gravitational distortions that compound over time, Rebecca explained. After about 25 years, they become strong enough to affect Earth's gravitational field. After 30 years. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. The simulation showed the ripples tearing apart the simulated planet. This is what Elliot, your son, is warning us about, Diane realized. But how does this get built if the original Project Horizon was rejected? Rebecca placed a hand on her belly as if communicating with the child inside. Because no one sees the complete picture, each component is being developed separately for legitimate purposes. The quantum communication array for deep space missions. The autonomous AI systems for monitoring distant probes. The gravitational wave detectors for astronomical research. But combined they create this anchor point, Lucas finished. Yes, Rebecca nodded. And according to my dreams, or my son's warnings, someone eventually puts them together. Who would do that? Diane asked. And why? Rebecca turned to Lucas with an unsettling intensity. In my dreams, it's always the same person who assembles the final device. A brilliant engineer who becomes obsessed with communicating through time after receiving messages from the future. The room fell silent as the implication became clear. Me, Lucas whispered. In the future, I build Project Horizon. When the next letter arrived the following morning, Diane, Lucas, and Rebecca gathered in the secure investigation room to read it together. Director Phillips joined them, his face haggard from sleepless nights. This envelope was thicker than the others, containing several pages of technical blueprints, along with the usual handwritten message. To those working to prevent catastrophe, I've attached complete specifications for the Horizon Anchor device as it was finally constructed. The individual components you're currently developing for separate projects will eventually be combined in this configuration. The synergy of these technologies creates a fixed reference point in space-time, a quantum anchor that doesn't move with the universe's expansion. This creates increasing gravitational distortions over time. By 2053, these distortions will become severe enough to alter Earth's orbit. By 2055, the planet's core destabilizes. We are currently in 2048 and already experiencing catastrophic weather patterns, tectonic instability, and gravitational anomalies. Over half the Earth's population is dead. I've been working with Lucas Merritt, the future version of him, to send these warnings back. The window for prevention is closing. In your timeline, a test of combined technologies is scheduled for Thursday. This test, while appearing harmless, establishes the initial anchor point that cannot be undone. You must stop this test at all costs. Dr. Elliot Grayson. Lucas spread out the blueprints, his hands trembling slightly. These components, I recognize all of them. They're from current NASA projects. Rebecca leaned over the designs, her scientific mind quickly grasping the implications. The quantum entanglement transmitter from my department, the gravitational wave detector array from astrophysics, the autonomous decision-making system from robotics, and the deep space telemetry processor my team has been developing, Lucas added quietly, all separate projects that were never meant to work together. Director Phillips studied the blueprint with growing alarm. Is this test happening? I haven't authorized any integrated test of these systems. Lucas pulled up the NASA testing schedule on his tablet, scrolling through the week's activities. He stopped suddenly, the color draining from his face. There it is. Thursday at 2 p.m. Cross-system communication protocol test, authorized by Dr. Alexander Weiss. Weiss? Phillips frowned. He doesn't have authority for multi-system testing. He's the acting director of advanced research while Dr. Chen is on sabbatical, Diane pointed out. That gives him temporary authorization. We need to stop that test, Rebecca said urgently, one hand on her belly, as if her unborn son was reinforcing the message. Phillips nodded grimly. I'll shut it down immediately. But we need to understand what's happening here. Why would Weiss integrate these systems without proper oversight? Maybe he doesn't understand what he's creating, Lucas suggested. Each component is harmless on its own. It's only when they're configured in this specific way that they create the anchor point. Or maybe he knows exactly what he's doing, Diane said quietly. They all turned to look at her. Think about it. If you discovered a way to communicate with the future, wouldn't you pursue it? The scientific breakthrough alone would be world-changing, let alone the practical applications. But the letters clearly state it leads to disaster, Phillips objected. A disaster decades away, Diane countered. Maybe Weiss believes the benefits outweigh the risks, or that they'll find a way to mitigate the consequences before they become severe. Lucas was still studying the blueprints, his expression troubled. There's something familiar about this design approach. It reminds me of theoretical papers I published a few years ago about integrated systems. A heavy silence fell over the room as the implication sank in. So, Elliot was right, Rebecca said softly. In some timeline, you do help create this. Not in this timeline, Lucas said firmly. Not now that we know what happens. Phillips stood up decisively. I'm cancelling the test and launching a full investigation into Dr. Weiss's activities. In the meantime, I want all of you to compile everything we know about Project Horizon and its components. We need to ensure this technology is never integrated. As they gathered the materials, Diane noticed something written on the back of the final blueprint page, a set of geographic coordinates and a single line in the now familiar handwriting. Find me here, see what becomes of us all. 2 days later, Diane's car bumped along a neglected mountain road outside of Houston, Lucas beside her in the passenger seat. They had debated whether to share the coordinates with Phillips or Rebecca, ultimately deciding to investigate themselves first. The test was officially cancelled, Lucas reported, checking his phone. Phillips is keeping Weiss under observation while they review all his recent activities. Good, Diane said, eyes on the winding road ahead. But I can't shake the feeling we're still missing something important. The coordinates led them deep into the wooded hillside, far from any official NASA facility. As they rounded a bend, a structure came into view. an old observatory, its white dome gleaming in the afternoon sun, despite its obvious state of abandonment. "What is this place?" Diane wondered aloud as they parked and approached the building. "Texas State Observatory," Lucas read from a weathered sign. "Decommissioned in 2008. The main entrance was locked, but they found a side door ajar, its rusty hinges protesting as Lucas pushed it open. Inside, dust motes danced in the beams of sunlight penetrating the dirty windows. Astronomical equipment lay draped in cloths, preserved like ghostly sentinels. Why would the coordinates lead us here? Diane wondered, her voice echoing slightly in the empty space. Lucas didn't answer, moving deeper into the building, with purpose, as if drawn by some invisible force. Diane followed him down a corridor to a small room that might once have been an office. Unlike the rest of the observatory, this room showed signs of recent use. A desk held modern equipment, a laptop, various electronic components, and stacks of papers. But what stopped them cold were the walls. Every inch was covered with letters, hundreds of them pinned in overlapping layers, all in the same handwriting they had come to know. Some appeared fresh, while others were yellowed and brittle with age. "My God," Diane whispered, stepping closer to read the nearest ones. Each was similar to the letters they had received, but with subtle variations, different details, different warnings, all signed by Dr. Elliot Grayson. Lucas moved to the desk where a single letter lay apart from the others. The date at the top read April 12th, 2025, tomorrow. Beside it sat a device unlike anything they had seen before. A small cylindrical object with intricate circuitry exposed on one side, connected to what appeared to be a modified quantum processor. "It's him," Lucas said hoarsely, picking up the unfinished letter. "Elliot's been sending the messages from here." "That's impossible," Diane objected. "Elliot Grayson hasn't even been born yet." "Not the Elliot," Lucas said, turning the letter to show her the bottom. Where Dr. Elliot Grayson should have been, this letter was signed differently. Lucas Merritt, with hope fading. Before Diane could respond, the device on the desk hummed to life, blue light pulsing from its core. A holographic projection flickered into existence above it, the image of an elderly man with Lucas's eyes, his face lined with exhaustion and sorrow. "If you're seeing this," the projection said, "then you found the observatory. I am Lucas Merritt, 30 years from your now. I've been working with Elliot Grayson to send warnings to the past, trying to prevent what we created." Diane stared at the hologram, then at Lucas, who stood frozen in shock. "The letters?" Holographic Lucas continued. "We've sent hundreds of them through the temporal aperture, targeting different points in NASA's timeline, trying to find the perfect moment to intervene. Each creates a branch, a potential new timeline, where the disaster might be averted." "But why sign them as Elliot?" Diane asked, forgetting momentarily that this was a recording. Surprisingly, the hologram responded. "I programmed this message to answer likely questions. We signed them as Elliot because in the first timeline, where I sent warnings back, I addressed them to myself. The result was catastrophic. Knowing my future self had mastered time communication only increased my determination to develop the technology." Lucas flinched at this revelation. "So, in subsequent attempts, we used Elliot's name. As Rebecca Grayson's son and my future research partner, he had the knowledge and credibility to be believed, without directly triggering my younger self's obsession with creating the very technology we were warning against." The hologram flickered, momentarily destabilizing before continuing. "The cruel irony is that in every timeline where we've sent warnings, the act of communication itself seems to ensure Project Horizon's creation. The warnings create fear, fear creates urgency, urgency leads to development of the very components needed for the anchor." "It's a causality loop," Lucas whispered. "Our warnings about the future help create that future. The holographic Lucas nodded sadly. We've tried different approaches across multiple timeline branches. Technical warnings, personal appeals, specific intervention points. But the outcome remains largely unchanged. The horizon anchor is created, and Earth's gravity eventually destabilizes. Then what can we do? Diane asked desperately. How do we break the cycle? The hologram's eyes seemed to look directly at Lucas. The common element in every timeline is me. My brilliance, my obsession, my need to understand and control time itself. Lucas stepped back as if physically struck by the words. The answer isn't in what you do, the hologram continued, but in what you don't do. The Project Horizon components must remain separate. The test must be cancelled. And most importantly, the aged Lucas leaned forward, his holographic eyes intense. I must walk away from this discovery. Completely. The message continued, explaining how Lucas would become fixated on temporal communication after these events, eventually leading him to independently rediscover and refine the Horizon technology, even while believing he was creating something different. In the end, the hologram said, voice heavy with regret, my pursuit of communication with the future ironically ensures that humanity has no future. Only by abandoning this path entirely can the loop be broken. The projection flickered one final time before dissolving into particles of light that faded into the air. Silence filled the room as Diane and Lucas stood surrounded by hundreds of warnings from a future desperately trying to rewrite itself. What do we do now? Diane finally asked. Lucas stared at the device on the desk, scientific curiosity visibly warring with the horror of what he'd just learned. After a long moment, he stepped back from the desk. We need to destroy it, he said quietly. This device, these plans, all of it. But the scientific breakthrough, Diane said, unable to help herself, the ability to communicate across time, is exactly what dooms us, Lucas finished firmly. My future self just confirmed it. The knowledge itself is the poison. Once we know it's possible, we can't help but pursue it. He picked up the device, studying it with a mixture of awe and revulsion. The components are familiar. I could probably reverse engineer this with existing technology. He laughed bitterly. That's the problem, isn't it? Every version of me eventually does exactly that. Diane moved to the walls, examining the dozens of letters. Look at the dates. Some go back decades. Others are addressed to NASA in the 1990s. He's been trying to change the past for years, creating branching timelines. And failing each time, Lucas added grimly. The sound of a car engine outside startled them both. Through the dusty window, they saw Director Phillips's government sedan pulling up beside their vehicle. How did he find us? Diane wondered. Rebecca must have told him about the coordinates, Lucas guessed, still holding the temporal device. Footsteps echoed through the abandoned observatory. Phillips appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from concern to shock as he took in the wall of letters. What is all this? He demanded. The source of our letters, Diane explained, and proof that we are caught in a time loop. In every timeline, we discover this place, learn how to communicate with the past, and eventually create the very disaster we're trying to prevent. Phillips approached slowly, reading the nearest letters. These are all different from the ones we received. Different attempts, different timelines, Lucas said, but always the same outcome. The director turned to Lucas, noting the device in his hands. And that is the technology that sends the messages back, a prototype of the Horizon anchor. Lucas's grip tightened on the device. We need to destroy it, sir. All of it. And then we need to ensure that the separate components are never combined. Phillips frowned. Destroy potentially revolutionary technology based on warnings from a future that might not even be our future. That's just it, Diane interjected. Every timeline where they discover this technology ends in disaster. The only path that hasn't been tried is complete abandonment of the research. And you believe that? Phillips asked Lucas directly. Lucas looked down at the device in his hands, the culmination of scientific dreams he didn't yet know he had. For a moment, Diane could see the temptation in his eyes, the desire to understand, to master this breakthrough, to be the man who conquered time itself. Then he placed the device back on the desk. "Yes," he said firmly, "I believe we need to walk away. Completely." Director Phillips ordered the observatory sealed as a classified site while they determined how to proceed. Armed guards were posted at the entrance, and the three of them returned to NASA headquarters to debrief Rebecca. "So my son really was sending the messages," she said when they finished explaining, her hands protectively cradling her belly, or at least some version of him in some future. "Working with some future version of me," Lucas added, still shaken by the revelation. They gathered in Phillips's office, the weight of their discovery hanging over them like a shadow. "We've cancelled Dr. Weiss's test permanently," Phillips informed them. When questioned, he admitted he was attempting to integrate the systems based on theoretical papers, but had no idea of the potential consequences. "That's how it starts," Diane said. "Innocent experimentation that sets us on the path." "So, what do we do?" Rebecca asked. "Abandon all quantum research? Shut down entire divisions of NASA?" "No," Lucas said firmly. "We establish new protocols. The components identified in the blueprints must be classified differently, with special oversight to ensure they're never integrated in the specified configuration." "And the observatory?" Phillips asked. "The device?" Lucas hesitated before answering. "Part of me wants to study it, to understand how it works." He smiled sadly. "Which is exactly why we can't. My future self was right about one thing. Once I start down that path, I won't stop until I've recreated Project Horizon." "We should destroy it," Diane suggested. "Completely." Phillips nodded slowly. "I agree. But first, I want everything documented. Photos, measurements, full technical analysis. All to be sealed in the most classified archive we have. Not for use, but as a warning to future generations." "A warning they might misinterpret as a challenge," Rebecca pointed out, echoing their fears. "That's a risk we'll have to take," Phillips conceded. "But we can't pretend this didn't happen. Too many people are already involved." As they discussed logistics, Diane's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from the security team at the observatory. "Someone broke in. The device is gone." "We need to go back," she said urgently, showing them the message. "Now!" The drive back to the observatory was tense, with Phillips following in his own vehicle. When they arrived, they found the guards confused but unharmed. "No alarms were triggered," the lead security officer reported. "We did hourly checks of the perimeter. Everything was secure until we did our interior sweep and found the room empty." The office that had been filled with letters was now completely bare. No papers on the walls, no device on the desk. Even the dust seemed undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. "This is impossible," Phillips muttered, looking around the empty room. "Where could it all have gone?" Lucas walked to the center of the room, turning slowly, as if searching for something invisible. "It's not gone," he said quietly. "It hasn't been here yet." "What do you mean?" Diane asked. "The date on the unfinished letter was tomorrow, remember? April 12th. Lucas pointed to the empty desk. "What if we weren't seeing the past, but the future? What if this is where I, or some version of me, will eventually set up the time communication device?" "That doesn't make sense," Phillips objected. "We all saw it. The letters, the device, the hologram." "Temporal echoes," Rebecca suggested, her scientific mind working through the problem. "Quantum entanglement across time could create impressions, echoes of events that haven't happened yet, but will happen." or might happen in some potential timeline. So none of it was real? Diane asked. It was real, Lucas insisted, but maybe not in our timeline, not yet. Phillips rubbed his temples, visibly struggling with the implications. So we saw a potential future that may or may not happen depending on what we do now? Exactly, Lucas said. And the fact that it's not here yet means we still have a chance to ensure it never materializes. Diane walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. So, what do we do? How do we make sure this timeline is different? Lucas joined her at the window. We do what my future self couldn't bring himself to do. We let it go. Completely. The next morning, Diane found an envelope on her desk. The now familiar cream-coloured paper, the same handwriting. But this letter was different. Diane, if you're reading this, our efforts have created yet another branch in time, another chance to break the cycle. The observatory was empty, because in your timeline we haven't built the device yet. But we will, unless you stop us. The key has always been Lucas. In every timeline, his brilliance and determination eventually lead him to solve the puzzle of temporal communication. Even knowing the consequences, he can't help himself. The challenge is too enticing, the potential too great. I've tried dozens of approaches across multiple timelines. This will be my last attempt. The energy required for these transmissions is depleting rapidly as Earth's gravity destabilizes. There is one timeline, one single branch, where the disaster might be averted. It requires something I've never tried before. Trust. Instead of providing warnings and technical details, I'm asking you to make a choice based on faith. Destroy this letter. Tell no one about it, and at 3 p.m. today make sure Lucas is at the Houston Memorial Hospital. This is our last chance, Elliot. Diane read the letter twice, her heart pounding. No technical specifications, no detailed warnings, just a simple request that made no apparent sense. Her first instinct was to call Lucas to share this new development, but the letter specifically asked her not to tell anyone. It asked for trust. After a moment of internal struggle, she made her decision. She took out her lighter and carefully burned the letter in her metal trash can, watching as the final words curled into ash. At 2:30 p.m. she called Lucas. "Hey, I need a favor," she said casually. "Can you meet me at Houston Memorial Hospital in about half an hour? I'm visiting a friend and could use the moral support." "Hospital?" Lucas sounded confused. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," she assured him. "I'll explain when you get there." At precisely 3 p.m, Lucas met Diane in the hospital lobby, looking concerned and slightly impatient. "So, who are we visiting?" he asked, as she led him towards the elevators. "You'll see," Diane replied mysteriously, pressing the button for the maternity floor. Understanding dawned on Lucas's face as they exited the elevator. "Rebecca, is she—" "In labor since this morning," Diane confirmed. "She asked for us to be here." They found the waiting area outside the delivery rooms, where Director Phillips was already seated, looking oddly emotional for such a composed man. "Glad you could make it," he greeted them. "The doctor says it won't be long now." Lucas sat down, still looking slightly bewildered. "I don't understand. Why didn't anyone tell me earlier?" "Rebecca wanted it this way," Diane said, the half-truth feeling strange on her lips. "She said it was important that you be here at exactly this time." Before Lucas could question further, a nurse appeared in the doorway. "You can come in now," she announced with a smile. "Mother and baby are doing wonderfully." They followed the nurse to a private room where Rebecca lay propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. "It's a boy," she said softly as they entered, "healthy and perfect." Lucas approached hesitantly, looking down at the newborn. The baby's eyes were closed, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. "Would you like to hold him?" Rebecca asked, looking directly at Lucas. Surprised, Lucas carefully accepted the swaddled infant, an expression of wonder spreading across his face as the tiny hand reflexively gripped his finger. "Have you decided on a name?" Phillips asked. Rebecca smiled, her eyes meeting Diane's, with something like understanding passing between them. "Yes," she said, "his name is Elliot. Elliot Grayson." Lucas looked up sharply, his gaze moving between Rebecca and Diane. "Elliot," he repeated softly, looking back down at the sleeping baby, "the man who tried to save the world." In the weeks that followed Elliot's birth, Diane watched Lucas carefully for any sign that he might be drawn toward temporal research. But something had changed in him since that day at the hospital. "I've been thinking about my career direction," he told her over coffee one morning. "I'm considering a transfer to the Mars Habitat Division." "Really?" Diane couldn't hide her surprise. "What about your work on deep space communication systems?" Lucas shrugged. "Someone else can handle that. I'm more interested in building things that will directly help people, sustainable environments, practical technologies." "This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain temporal warning from the future, would it?" she asked carefully. "Maybe," he admitted, "but not in the way you might think. Holding Elliot that day, it made everything real in a way that all those letters and blueprints didn't. That's a real child who deserves a future." Diane smiled, relief washing over her. "I think that's a wonderful reason to change direction." At NASA, other changes were underway. Director Phillips had established new protocols for quantum research, with special oversight committees to ensure that certain technologies remained separate. Dr. Weiss had been reassigned to a different division, his integration experiments permanently shelved. The observatory was demolished, the land reclaimed by the state for a natural preserve. No trace remained of the temporal device or the wall of letters, whether they had been real or merely echoes of a future that would now never exist. Rebecca had taken an extended maternity leave, focusing all her attention on her son. When Diane visited them, she couldn't help but study baby Elliot's face, looking for traces of the man who had tried so desperately to warn them. "Do you think we've changed things?" Rebecca asked one afternoon as they watched Elliot sleeping in his crib. "Really changed them, I mean." "I think so," Diane said. "Lucas has completely shifted his research focus. The components that would have been integrated are now classified separately. The test that would have created the initial anchor point never happened." "But time is strange," Rebecca mused. "My research showed that even quantum entangled particles eventually find their way back to their natural state. What if the universe wants this to happen?" "Then we'll keep making different choices," Diane said firmly. "That's what Elliot was trying to tell us all along. Not just to stop a specific project, but to change our approach entirely." As weeks turned to months, life at NASA returned to normal, or a new normal. The mysterious letters became a classified secret, known only to the few people directly involved. Without new communications, even their certainty about what they had experienced began to fade. Had they really received messages from the future? Or had it been an elaborate hoax, a security breach that led them to discover a potentially dangerous research direction? Sometimes even Diane wasn't sure anymore, but one thing remained certain. The future that had sent those desperate warnings was no longer their destination. They had changed course. 6 months after Elliot's birth, Lucas invited Diane to his new office in the Mars Habitat Division. The space was filled with models of sustainable living modules and agricultural systems designed for the Red Planet. "What do you think?" he asked proudly, gesturing to the designs covering his walls. "It's amazing," Diane said honestly. "You've accomplished so much in such a short time." Lucas nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. "It feels right, building a future instead of whatever I was heading toward before." He opened a drawer in his desk and removed a small metal object, a component that Diane recognized from the blueprints of the Horizon anchor. "I kept this," he admitted, Just this one piece. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, reminding myself of the path not taken. Diane tensed. Is that wise? Probably not, Lucas acknowledged with a wry smile. But it helps me remember what's at stake. He returned the component to the drawer. I haven't been tempted to do anything with it. If that's what you're worried about, it's just a reminder. A reminder of what? That knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. That just because we can do something doesn't mean we should. He looked at her thoughtfully. You know, I never asked how you knew to bring me to the hospital that day, exactly when Elliot was born. Diane hesitated, then decided on honesty. I received one final letter. It asked me to make sure you were there at that specific time, and to tell no one about the letter. Not even me? Lucas raised an eyebrow. Especially not you, I think. She studied his reaction. Are you upset I kept it from you? He considered this before answering. No, I think I understand. Seeing Elliot, holding him, it made everything we'd learned personal in a way nothing else could have. That was the moment I decided to change direction with my research. So we broke the cycle, Diane said softly. Let's hope so. Lucas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the NASA campus spread below. The thing about time is that we can never be sure. Maybe in some other timeline, some other version of me is still pursuing temporal communication. Maybe there are infinite branches, infinite possibilities. That's a pretty heavy thought for a Monday morning, Diane observed. Lucas laughed. You're right, and ultimately, it doesn't matter. We can only be responsible for our own choices, our own timeline. He turned back to her. Speaking of which, Director Phillips is assembling a team for a new project, designing communication protocols for the first manned mission to Europa. He asked if you'd be interested. Europa? That's definitely looking toward the future rather than trying to change the past. Exactly. No time manipulation, no quantum anchors. Just good old-fashioned exploration of our solar system. Diane smiled. I'd like that. Later that afternoon, she visited Rebecca and Elliot at their home. The baby, now 6 months old, was alert and curious, his eyes tracking her movements with uncanny focus. He's growing so fast, Diane remarked, letting Elliot grip her finger in his tiny hand. Too fast, Rebecca agreed with a mother's wistfulness. I keep wondering what he'll become. What kind of man he'll be. A different one, I hope, Diane said softly. One who never has to send desperate warnings across time. I dream about him sometimes, Rebecca admitted. Not like before, no visions or warnings. Just normal dreams about his future. In them, he's always happy. Always safe. I like that future better, Diane said, watching, as Elliot's eyes began to droop with sleep. As she prepared to leave, Rebecca handed her a small envelope. Before I forget, this came for you in my mail by mistake. There's no return address. Diane froze, staring at the cream-coloured envelope with her name handwritten on the front in familiar handwriting. When did this arrive? She asked, keeping her voice steady. Today? Is everything okay? Fine, Diane assured her, slipping the envelope into her purse. Probably just a thank you note from someone at work. Outside in her car, she carefully opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just 2 sentences. Thank you for trusting me. This timeline is safe. It was signed simply, E.G. Diane stared at the paper for a long moment, then looked up at Rebecca's house where baby Elliot was sleeping peacefully, his future once again unwritten. She'd started her car and drove toward the horizon, the letter safe in her purse. One final message, not from the future that was, but from the future that would be.